Ward's itinerant troupe of players that toured in North Britain and Scotland. Reviewers said he was pretty good at portraying Scottish, Irish, and French characters, but he wasn't so good with British characters because of his heavy Scottish accent, which kind of makes me wonder how good he really was at the French characters too. And he wrote at least 83 plays, 2 history books, and 3 books of poetry over about a 40-year span. So he's a pretty prolific guy. This is just a bit of the cover of one of his plays, The Coup de Main, or The American Adventurers. And why do we care about him? Well, it just so happens that before he started doing any of this, he was a soldier in the 26th Regiment of Foot. And the 26th Regiment of Foot served in the American Revolution, and in fact was one of the regiments involved in the storming of Fort Montgomery in October 1777. Now, Archibald McLaren enlisted in the army in about 1775, but in Great Britain, and then he came over as a recruit for the 26th Regiment, landed in New York on September 26, 1777, and then just 2 weeks later, not even 2 weeks later, he was involved in this attack on this fort here, as far as we can tell. And he left a good tip-off about this, because in the front of some of his plays, he writes exactly who he was and something about his military career. So I'm going to talk about these regiments that stormed the fort. I'm going to single out 2 of them. There were 5 British regiments involved in the storming of Forts Clinton and Montgomery, if I have this right, and also a detachment of British dragoons, a couple of German regiments, and 5 loyalist regiments or corps or other military organizations. So I'm going to single out 2 of these. I had told Grant when I signed up for this talk that I was going to do all 5, and it turns out that for the kind of information I'm going to show you, it's really, really hard to find this information, and it takes a long time, and 2 is all I could deal with right now. We'll get to the others someday. We're going to look at the 26th Regiment of Foot. Now, when did the American Revolution begin? When did the fighting break out? Anybody?
April 19th, 1775.
1775, right. 26th Regiment of Foot arrived in America in 1767. There were British troops in America long before a war broke out. And it's very important to remember that most of the troops who fought in this war didn't enlist in the army to go fight a war in America. They were soldiers in an army, and a war started. Some of them were posted in America. Some were sent to America to try to prevent a war from starting, and a war started anyway. So they weren't over here to pick a fight. They were over here and a fight started. 26th Regiment was posted in New Jersey in 1767 and through 1770, in Amboy and Raritan and Elizabeth, that part of New Jersey. In 1770, they were put on ships in New York, and they sailed up the Hudson River right past here in 1770. And I'm sure that men who were still in the regiment 7 years later were pretty surprised to get back here again. They were posted in Quebec, and posts along the Richelieu River, that river that runs from Montreal, runs from Lake Champlain to Montreal. And in 1775, an American expedition, after the war began, went up and captured some of those places. You may have heard of Fort Ticonderoga, captured in May 1775. It was garrisoned by soldiers of the 26th Regiment of Foot. The rest of the regiment was captured in October and November of that year while manning various posts along that river. The men were sent as prisoners of war to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So now here they walk from the area near Montreal to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Then they get exchanged, because you exchange prisoners of war sometime, and they walk to New York, and then they're involved in campaigning in New Jersey again. And finally, in October 1777 rather, they make this expedition up the Hudson River. Now, after all this capturing and things, their strength was depleted. So in the course of 1777, a lot of new recruits arrived for them. 232 men arrived in September 1777, including Archibald McLaren, and then they went right into battle. There were a total of about 600 men in the regiment at the time of the storming of these forts. We don't know exactly how many of the men who were on the strength of the regiment actually participated in the fighting. There's no way to find that out, but we can assume it was most of them. And one of them was named Thomas Battersby. He was born in 1744 in Dromore in County Down in Ireland. He had no trade, so in army documents they call him a laborer. And he enlisted in the 26th Regiment of Foot in 1759, which is unusually young for an enlistment of a soldier. But there was a big war going on at that time, which is one of the factors that allows him to get in at an unusually young age. He was captured with most of his regiment at St. John's on the Richelieu River in November 1775, sent to Pennsylvania. We just talked about that. Exchanged, as we talked about. He participated in the attack on Fort Montgomery. We'll get to that in a minute. And then, what happens to these soldiers? Well, he went into another regiment in 1779, and that regiment was sent back to Quebec. Then he was drafted into another regiment. He stayed in the Army until 1791, served 30 years and 8 months in the Army. He got a pension for his service. And on his pension deposition, he said he was wounded in the left leg in a skirmish at some river, and then in North America, and then in the left shoulder at the reduction of Fort Montgomery. And he was worn out from long service, as you might expect, after almost 31 years, and 2 wounds in battle. That one part that's illegible is because I got this document off of microfilm, and they clipped off a sliver of the film, so if I could see the original, it would be legible, but sadly it's not. And he signed his name on his discharge paper, as we see here. And the neat thing about finding a British soldier with a career like this, 31 years in the Army, is this is a very, very common type of career for British soldiers who served in the American Revolution. How long was the war in America?
8 years.
8 years. 31 years of service. And this is a very typical kind of career. The majority of British soldiers who served in the American Revolution were career soldiers, and if they survived the various hardships of being a soldier, it was very common for them to serve 20, 25, 30, 35, even 40 years in the Army. So this one war was just a small chapter in a long career. The other regiment I picked out is the 52nd Regiment of Foot. Here's a nice recruiting poster for them in the Eric Schnitzer collection, actually. Friend of ours here. This regiment arrived in Quebec in 1765. So again, by the time they served at Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton, they'd been in America for 12 years already. Now again, not every single man, because there's some attrition, but some of them that much time. They recruited soldiers in America as well as Great Britain. There were at least 7 pensioners I found who were born in this country. Same with the 26th Regiment. We'll get to some of this stuff later here. This regiment had 101 men killed and wounded at Bunker Hill out of about 400 total. So they really got clobbered at this one battle in 1775, but they fought on. 80% of the regiment was involved in the attack on Fort Montgomery, 8 out of 10 companies. So not quite the whole thing. There were 194 men who were in the regiment before 1775, were still in the regiment by October of 1777. So that's about half of the men who participated in the attack here had been in the regiment for the entire war and longer. And the other half was made up of newer men who joined. So 246 more men joined during the course of the war, but not all of them were brand new to the Army. Some of them were draftsmen brought in from other regiments to fill out the ranks. So anytime we talk about, and sometimes in books you'll see, recruits arrived. Well, those recruits are not necessarily brand new enlistees untrained. Sometimes they're highly experienced men from other places. 32 of the recruits who arrived were Germans or Europeans, that included Poles and Swedes and Hungarians and other nationalities, but mostly German. But a pretty cosmopolitan regiment by the time they were here at Fort Montgomery. and one of them was named William Wainwright. He was born in South Wingfield in Derbyshire in England, and he learned the trade of a hosier, so he made stockings. Joined the 50th Regiment of Foot in 1767, and that regiment served in the West Indies in the 1770s, actually in a war in the West Indies in 1773, the Carib War. A lot of these guys who served in the American Revolution were veterans of a recent war that happened in the Caribbean. By the time he was drafted into the 52nd Regiment of Foot in 1776, now this was his second rebellion he had been sent to quash, the first one in the West Indies. After the attack on Fort Clinton in Montgomery, he was drafted into yet another regiment and sent back to the West Indies, and then drafted into yet another regiment. Discharged in 1799 at the age of 44, and if you're good at math, you can see he spent most of his life in the Army by this time. And then he served 2 more years in an invalid corps. Again, nothing unusual about a military career like this for a British soldier who served in America. Let's look a little more closely at these regiments, the nationalities. I'm saying they're British regiments, and that includes which nations?
Wales, Scotland.
Wales, Scotland, yeah.
Northern Ireland yet?
Well, they didn't call it Northern Ireland, it was just Ireland, but yeah. Yeah, it includes a lot of places. These are British regiments. Sometimes books will call them English regiments, but they're not all English. Mix of nationalities. Often you'll see British regiments referred to with names like the Cheshire Regiment and the Staffordshire Regiment and things. Those titles were given to regiments in 1782. When did the American Revolution end? 83. When did it begin? How much bearing did these county titles have on these regiments when they were serving in America? 0, right. So regiments, most British regiments recruited from all over Great Britain. So you don't have Scottish regiments and Irish regiments and Welsh regiments. Even regiments that have that word in their names are not one specific thing. There are exceptions, none of which apply to the regiments we're talking about. So in these 2 regiments, so far, because I haven't done a real deep dive on them, but in the 26th Regiment out of 607 men who were in the regiment in 1777, I've determined the nationality of 138 of them so far. And in the 52nd Regiment out of 439 who were here in October 1777, I know 105. And you can see that it's a mix of nationalities, and you can see that the proportions are quite different in these 2 regiments, which just gives a hint that if somebody is going to talk about what's a typical British regiment like, well, what were they usually like? Well, they were all different. You know, everyone was a little community, and communities have different mixtures. And if you start trying to talk about the average, then you lose the texture of each of the individual communities and the things that make them distinctive, right? George Gruber was one of the men in the 52nd Regiment of Foot, or I should say Georg Gruber, born in Spangenberg in Hesse-Kassel. Now, you've all heard of Hessians, right? Mm-hmm. Well, he wasn't one of them. Even though he was from Hesse-Kassel, where all the Hessians were from, he was enlisted into a British regiment, namely the 52nd Regiment of Foot. He was 5 foot 8.5 inches tall. He had followed the Reformed religion, and he was a linen weaver by trade. He did a little bit of service in the Hesse-Kassel army before enlisting into British service in the town of Munden in Lower Saxony. So he didn't enlist in his hometown by any stretch. He, with other German recruits, were sent to America. He happened to arrive with another batch of German recruits in June of 1777. Participates in attack on Fort Montgomery. And he's drafted into the 55th Regiment of Foot, sent to the West Indies, and then he goes on into the 32nd Regiment, and into the 76th Regiment, finally discharged in August of 1803. Again, not an unusual career for a British soldier, even though he's not even British. A little bit about ages here. Usually when I give a talk about British regiments, I play the British soldier age game. Some of you have played before. We're not going to play today, sorry. Just gonna straight up and babble all the information this time. When you enlisted in the Army in peacetime, you didn't enlist for a stint of 4 years or a hitch of 2 years or what have you, like it's so common today. You just enlisted, very much in the way you think of, you take a job. When you get a job, you don't usually say, well, give me the job for 2 years, please, and then I will quit. You just join, and you stay in the Army until the Army discharges you. Now, the Army can discharge you for any reason they want. You can ask to be discharged, but the Army can say no. But you'll generally be discharged when you no longer are fit for service. So what does fit for service mean? Well, remember I talked about all those guys who were in Canada and they had to walk to Pennsylvania and then they had to walk back to New York and then to walk. Yeah, British soldiers on April 19th, 1775, the day of Lexington and Concord, walked from Boston to Concord, Massachusetts, and back within a 24-hour period, fighting half the way. That's about a 40-mile round trip. So fit for service means you're able to do that kind of thing. Well, some people stay fit for service into their 40s and early 50s, right? Some don't, but some do. After the war began and there was a need for more soldiers, the enlistment law was changed slightly. It said you're allowed to enlist for a term of 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever is longer. So you can get your discharge after 3 years. And that ends up being about a third of the soldiers who served in America during the war. So the majority of soldiers who served in America were career soldiers, and then a significant portion, but not the majority, were these guys who did in fact enlist for a shorter period of time. So how old are we talking about for British soldiers? Well, these two regiments we're talking about have 1,047 men all together in the 26th and 52nd Regiment of Foot on October 7th, 1777, when the forts were stormed. And I know the ages so far of 245. I said, we know the ages. When I wrote this slide, it was, I know the ages. But now I'm going to tell you, so we all know the ages, right? 4 men in the 26th Regiment and 9 men in the 52nd were under the age of 20. 30 in the one and 18 in the other were between the ages of 20 and 30. 49 and 30 respectively, between the ages of 31 and 40. And 52 in one and 53 in another, over 40 years of age. So see, when I'm talking about guys with long careers, I'm not lying to you, right? It ends up being that the majority of British soldiers in America are between the ages of 25 and 40 years old, about 60% of them, and then about 20% of them are under the age of 25, and about 20% of them are over the age of 40. But again, these are guys who enlist as a career, and then they've got a physically demanding career, so they stay moderately fit, and they serve 20, 25 years, 30 years, longer. Now, the old conscripts question. Some of you have heard me give talks about British soldiers before, so I'm going to ask you, if you already heard the answer from me, don't answer the question, all right? Compulsory service, men pressed into service, things like whatever you want to call it. Today we call it being drafted, even though that term had a different meaning in this time period. What proportion of these men in the Army when the war broke out do you think are conscripts? They're not given the choice of serving in the Army.
Convicts.
Anybody, pardon?
Convicts.
Convicts, anybody? The portion of men in the British Army when the war broke out who were conscripts is 0, because it was not legal to conscript people into the Army in Great Britain in times of peace.
Wow.
Even the convicts were given the choice of going to jail or going to the Army, and it was their choice. Enlistment was voluntary. Now, sometimes it might be a choice among bad choices, right? But it's still voluntary. By October of 1777, what's the proportion? Well, it's still 0. Now, in in 1778, this changed a little bit. There were some new laws made, not because of the war in America, but because of the war with France, right? Now you really need men because instead of having an enemy that's 3,000 miles away, you've got an enemy that you can see on a clear day if you're standing in the right place, right? So they make a new law that says, okay, you can conscript people, but only in very limited conditions and very special circumstances can you do it. So hardly any of the soldiers who served in America during the American Revolution were conscripts. And boy, do a lot of books mess this up and totally misunderstand what the recruiting laws were like, and just look at this little time period when it was possible to conscript men and just assume that that means all men were conscripts. Absolutely not the case. Let's look at a guy who wasn't a conscript. Charles Morrison, born in 1751, Keith Parish, Bempshire. He was a weaver. If you're really looking closely, you've noticed that we've done an Englishman, an Irishman, a Scot. Now we're back to another Scotsman here. Joined the 52nd Regiment of Foot in 1770. He was wounded in the head and the thigh at the taking of Fort Montgomery. Ouch and ouch again. So what does a guy like this do after he gets these war wounds? Well, it's a career soldier, yeah. A year later, he just gets put in another regiment. That regiment goes off to the West Indies. He ends up staying in the Army, discharged in February of 1791 as a sergeant in the Army. So again, getting wounded a couple times at war doesn't stop your career here. If you've really been watching closely, you'll see we had a laborer, a linen weaver, a playwright, and who was the other one so far? Hosier. So a lot of these guys have learned a skilled trade. Average enlistment age for British soldiers. Again, I already said I don't like to just use averages, but most British soldiers enlisted between the ages of about 20 and 25, with the vast majority around 22 or so. It was possible to enlist at a much younger age, but if you were to do a graph of this, which I have done, but I don't have one to show, you'd find soldiers can get into the Army as young as 12 if they're drummers, but to carry a musket you have to be fully grown, which can be as young as maybe 15. So if you were to graph the enlistment ages, you'd start down here and you'd see around 15 or so, the graph would start climbing up, climbing up, climbing up. Gets to be around 20, climbs up a little more, gets around 21 or 22, 23, and it goes way up, and then goes way back down, 24, 25, 26, all the way out to, I can show examples of men who enlisted for the first time at the age of 45 and served until they were 51. But not very many. They're way out here in the tails of the curve, right? The vast majority of the guys enlisted when they were around 21. Now, what do you think these guys were doing before they enlisted? Going to high school or college? In 18th century England? Yeah, probably not. Now, a lot of them did go to school, but in 18th century England, you're doing that till you're maybe 12 most of the time, except in very rare cases do you go on to any greater education. So you got to get a job, son. So many of these guys had had some kind of a trade that they went into before joining the Army, and then either they didn't like their trade or they didn't do too well in it for whatever reason, they go to the Army after they've learned some other skill. Actual experience may have been limited. Some guys ran away from apprenticeships. Some people just bounced from job to job. Good thing that doesn't happen anymore, right? So I've looked at these two regiments and found what trades I can. Again, very preliminary research so far. The numbers that I have here are about 250 guys who I have real detailed information for out of 1,000 altogether. I don't look at that as a good statistical sample because it's way less than half, but it's what we've got. And it turns out if you compare this to other regiments that we've looked at more deeply, it stacks up pretty well. 1,047 men altogether, found trades for 224, so about a quarter of them. 109 of them had no trades, so they're called laborers. And the other 113 had skilled trades. Pretty even split. If we compare this to other regiments that we know more about, it's a little bit off. Usually the trades run about 55% and the laborers run about 45%, but we're still in the ballpark. And I bet you if I had all the rest of the numbers, they'd level out. So now we have like the really badly composed slide in the deck, which I apologize for. I tried to think of a nice way to divide all this up, and it came out like this, and it looks terrible. But in the on the left-hand side, we have the trades that are in common between both regiments. So we have 62 laborers in one and 47 in the other. Now remember, the 52nd Regiment is only about 3/4 the size of the 63rd. We're comparing 600 men with 400 men. So it ends up being pretty equal proportions, right? Weavers, 28 in one, 11 in the other. Tailors, 10 and 4. Shoemakers, 4 and 2. Carpenters, 2 each. 2 wool combers in one and 1 in the other. 1 baker in each. 2 cutlers and 1 cutler. A miller in each one, and a smith in one and 2 in the other. In the 26th Regiment, we have 2 each of blacksmiths, butchers, and shearmen, guys who cut the wool off a sheep. And we have 1 each of breeches maker, a comedian. Who do you suppose the comedian is in the 26th Regiment? He introduced him right at the beginning. Remember that playwright? Yeah, there we go. That's him. We have a dyer, a miner, a stockinist, a tin man who is not like a Wizard of Oz man made out of tin, you know. An upholsterer. In the 52nd Regiment, we have 2 clothiers, 2 cordwainers, 2 hosiers, 2 masons, a nailer, and we have 1 each of assistant medic, barber, book printer, buckle maker, button maker, cook, courier, distiller, founder, linen weaver, pewter caster, scissor smith, silk weaver, skinner, stay maker, and student. We have quite a diverse cast of characters here, right? And the Army can benefit from having a pretty high number of tailors in the ranks when you have clothing to fit and maintain, shoemakers in the ranks, when you're going to go into barracks and quarters, and you have carpenters and cutlers and sawyers in the rank. You have people who can do the kinds of things that an army that moves from place to place needs to maintain what they do. You know, you have a very itinerant community, but in a lot of ways self-sufficient because you have a lot of tradesmen in the ranks. I'm going to look quickly at a guy who's not a tradesman in the ranks at all. Not even in the ranks. William Hunter. Not a soldier, but the son of a soldier. His father was John Hunter, a sergeant in the 26th Regiment of Foot, a long-serving sergeant. Irishman, married a Portuguese-Irish woman. Had her son, he was born in Amboy, New Jersey in 1768 or 69. So, American-born child in this regiment. And he remembered, my father was with the detachment and aided in the storming of Fort Montgomery, in which the British lost considerable men. Now, William Hunter, and his mother and his siblings are all in New York, and they see their father go up the river, and then they start hearing about this battle. I well recollect seeing the wounded carried to the hospital the day after they were landed from the shipping in New York, a few days after the battle. Ignorant of the fate of my father and fearing that he might be amongst them, I was struck with horror at the sight of the pale and death-like countenances of the unfortunate victims of the bloody contest as they passed along upon the shoulders of their comrades. It was an awful sight, and to a young mind, excited like mine, then was by the most anxious apprehensions for the fate of a beloved parent and indescribably shocking. So, this is the other part of the war that we don't get when we think about the soldiers storming the fort. Their families are just a few miles down the river, wondering what's become of them. Will they come back at all? And many of them didn't. Fortunately for William Hunter, his father did come back, served a few more years. They went back to England. And if you want to know more about William Hunter, a colleague of mine literally wrote the book on him. He ended up being a prominent printer in America after the war. A lot to be said about him, a whole book's worth. Humphrey Smart was born in 1747 in Dudley Parish, Worcestershire. 5'6" tall, gray hair, gray eyes, brown complexion. He was a nailer by trade. That's a man who makes nails, not pounds them in. He enlisted in the 6th Regiment of Foot on January 1st, 1775. A very rare case where I know the exact day when a man enlisted. Very soon drafted into another regiment. Drafted in this time period means draft, like a draft horse or a draft beer, means pulling from one place to another. And soldiers who are drafted are not pulled from the civilian world into the army, but pulled from one regiment into another one. So he's drafted into the 52nd Regiment, got a gunshot wound in the right hand at Fort Montgomery, but nonetheless was drafted into the 27th Regiment, and then received a pension in 1783, served later in a veteran battalion, and now I'm not remembering why I singled him out in particular, except maybe because he has a cool name. And then when he went to sign his discharge, he put his mark, which maybe was because he got a gunshot wound in his right hand a long time ago, I don't know. These two regiments that served at Fort Clinton and Montgomery in October 1777, this is the other badly composed slide, by the way, joined the British Army in Philadelphia in late 1777. So after they finished up here in this attack on the Hudson River, they went back to New York, then they were sent to reinforce the British Army that had just taken Philadelphia. The 26th Regiment, 3 years later, in 1780, were drafted, which means they're soldiers who were fit for service were sent into other regiments. The men who were not fit for service anymore were discharged from the army, and they went back to England to re-recruit, reconstitute the regiment after sending all those men away. Unfit men discharged, fit men sent in other regiments. Most of them went into the 42nd, or the Royal Highland Regiment, which after the war went to Nova Scotia, and others went into the 44th Regiment of Foot, which went on to Quebec. 52nd Regiment, they were drafted in October of 1778. I don't know why I put that same thing in there again. The fit men were put into regiments that went to the West Indies, which was a lousy place to go during this time. This picture down at the bottom is actually an encampment in the West Indies. There were palm trees here, but I had to cut them off to make the slide fit. I'm going to talk about 3 more people and then we'll be done, so hang in there. John MacDonald was born in 1751 in Athlone in County Roscommon, 5'5" tall, gray hair, gray eyes, fair complexion, laborer, enlisted in March 15th, 1775. So this was a very common enlistment age, 24 years old. Arrived in America in April 1777. Wounded in the breast at Fort Montgomery. Nonetheless, sent into the 23rd Regiment of Foot when his regiment was drafted, where he got to be a prisoner of war at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Spent 18 months as a prisoner of war, as they all did, repatriated, discharged in 1784, and one of his officers wrote this nice little tribute. He behaved on all occasions as a sober, good soldier, he being discharged for being undersized. 5'5", well, in peacetime you want soldiers who are at least 5'6", but in wartime you relax that a little bit, largely so you can recruit in Scotland where there are a lot of shorter people. He then stayed in the army. He went back in the army for another, how many years does that work out to be? 15 years, from 1793 to 1809. So he's finally discharged from the army in 1809 after enlisting in 1775. Again, nothing unusual about a career like this. There are puzzling people here and there, or a little more puzzling or unusual careers. Thomas Monroe, another soldier in the 26th Regiment, he enlisted in July 1773. We don't know his nationality, or I don't think I know his nationality. Maybe it'll come up on the slide later, and I just don't remember. But he may have enlisted in America, is what I'm getting at with that. He always bore a fair character, that's good to know. And he was with the regiment captured on the St. Lawrence River in November 1775. But some of the prisoners were sick. I had mentioned that they were sent to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Well, they floated them down the river partway to this town called Esopus, which is near.
Esopus.
Oh, okay, that's the place, yes. This town that you call Esopus, yes. And some of the sick people were left behind there because they weren't fit for now going this long haul to Lancaster. And then he deserted, which some soldiers did, especially when you're a prisoner of war, things prospects are bad. And then he did an opportunistic thing. He enlisted in the American Army and he became an officer's servant. Well, that in itself is no big surprise. Men deserted in droves from both sides and joined the armies on the other side, mainly because they're just opportunists. They're not out there for their great, political convictions or principles or anything. They're there because they need the work. If you're captured by the other side and now you're surrounded by them and you've had enough and you still need work, joining the other army, hey, it's right there. But sometimes it can be a really bad career move, because then he was at Fort Montgomery in October 1777. And guess who comes? Son of a gun. Probably ran into some old friends there. Well, he did. And in fact, he was tried by a general court-martial for deserting and bearing arms in the rebel army. But he told a pretty good story because they acquitted him, and he was put back into the regiment in the ranks. Now, the proceedings of his trial exist, and he did seem to have a pretty good case to make for himself. Many soldiers enlisted in the opposing army in order to get close to the front lines so they could desert again and get back to their old friends. And for some reason, he died in Philadelphia on May 15th, 1778. We don't know the reason, because unfortunately, most army documents just tell us when a man died. They don't tell us why. And we can guess, but one thing I've learned as a historian is that I am a terrible guesser. Elizabeth Wilson, okay, she wasn't a soldier, right? But she was married to a soldier. She was married to Joseph Wilson in the 26th Regiment. He was born in 1751 in Bradford in West Yorkshire, and he was a tailor by trade. In 1775, we know that the couple had 4 children, because the whole lot of them, the husband, the wife, and the 4 children, were captured at St. John's, Quebec, and sent to prison in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So, you think it's bad having to move a family of 4? Try under these circumstances. Now we start to lose track a little bit. What we know about Joseph Wilson is, I wrote Joseph Wilson, that's weird, because his name was William, not Joseph. This is what I get for making slides late at night. William Wilson, who we'll call Joseph just for now, stayed with his regiment. They exchanged. He stayed with the regiment, went back to England. He was discharged. He received a pension. But for some reason that we do not know, she stayed in New York. And she sold fruit from a fruit stand in Corlair's Slip in Lower Manhattan, which was the only Manhattan at that time. Now, we don't know why this happened. Remember I said the 26th Regiment had been in New Jersey way back in the 1760s? Maybe that's where they got married. Maybe she was American and didn't want to go back. Maybe. Don't know. Don't know. But what we do know is that her life got kind of rough. People said that she was much addicted to liquor, frequently intoxicated, and she had no known place of abode, but was frequently seen lying drunk behind stoops. It gets worse. She was found dead on October 21st, 1783, in an abandoned house in New York. And the coroner's report, which is how we know all this information, found no external marks of violence on her body, attributed the cause of her death. They ascribed her cause of death as liquor or sickness. And I point this out because, again, there were the soldiers who stormed Fort Montgomery, and then there were people connected to them. And there's so much about those people that we just don't know. We find these fragments, a coroner's report that tells us only this much, and we compare it to the muster rolls and find her husband, and all it does is give us a big mystery about what her life was really like and how she went from being a mother of 4 children to being dead in an abandoned house in New York. And that's all I have. If you like these stories about British soldiers, I have, I put up the wrong slide. We'll go to that one, yeah. If you like these stories about British soldiers, I have a blog with lots of little experts, little personal biographies of individual people, individual soldiers, their wives, their children. Here, if you have questions that we don't get to tonight, or if you care about any of this and want to contact me, my email address is here. And as Grant mentioned, I'm the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which is an online magazine that is absolutely free to subscribe to. So for that reason alone, highly recommend it. And if you want to learn more about British soldiers in America, I've written books. You can find them on any major online retailer. But I always tell you, ask your local independent bookstore to order the book instead of ordering it from the online major retailers. That's better for the publisher, it's better for the author, and it's better for the bookstore. All right, thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Okay, I'm gonna start here. You got your hand up first.
You mentioned the families who came. Did the majority of soldiers have family who came with them, or did the majority of the family stay home?
Glad you asked that question, because that's gonna be my very next book, if I ever actually write it. I've been studying families of British soldiers, wives of British soldiers a great deal. About 20% of the British soldiers who served in America had their wives with them in America. Some of them were women they married when they were in America, and some were women who came with them from Great Britain. Some of them got back home, some didn't, clearly. Some of them had children, so it ends up, if you look at a typical British regiment of about 500 soldiers, you'll find about 80 wives and about 80 children also listed as part of the regiment. They're getting food from the army, and women are working in jobs that support the army, like washerwomen, nurses, sutlers, and various other kinds of work that supports the military infrastructure. So about 20% in an army of about 50,000 soldiers. So you're talking about between 5,000 and 10,000 women here, which is why that's enough to write a book about and why I'm working on it. Great question. You had a question.
The numbers that you gave earlier, did they include officers?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because I forgot to mention that everything I just talked about, all those numbers, is just the sergeants, corporals, drummers, and fifers, and private soldiers. I said nothing in this talk about officers, just because I don't study the officers. I could, but it takes that much more time and effort to do it, and I'm way too lazy. So no, everything all those numbers were just the common soldiers, the men in the ranks.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I've been to Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Oh, so have I.
I did not see anything in the way of any evidence of the prison of war camp that you're talking about. Can you tell me where it might have been?
I can't tell you, like, I don't know my Lancaster. Some of my ancestors are from York, Pennsylvania, where they're also prisoner of war camp. And some of their houses are still there. The prisoner of war camp areas are not, these were very temporary stockade camps that were built. Well, let me step back a second. Lancaster, before the war began, had a barracks. So prisoners of war were sent there because there's a barracks. There was a place where you could actually outfit these people. That's why these prisoners are sent to Lancaster specifically. I don't know where exactly that barracks was, but if you drop me an email, I can send you a book that talks a great deal about it and probably has some specifics, Cole Jones' book.
It's interesting, there's not a marker sign or anything like that anywhere in Lancaster that says this is where that barracks was?
I haven't looked for one myself. I can't say there isn't one. Like, I'm sure that people at their historical society know, but I have not bothered to look myself. Anybody from Lancaster here who knows more? Yeah, so,
College there.
I mean, yeah, I've been to Lancaster, but I've never thought to look for exactly where the prisoners were. I'm sure we can find that. And again, if you shoot me an email, I can probably find it in the meantime. Later on, when they're sending prisoners of war to Lancaster and York and a few other places out there, Carlisle as well, they built temporary stockaded camps, which were not designed to stick around, and they fell back to the land. The locations are known, but there's not really anything there to see. I believe it's in York, though, where there are people who've done archaeological work at some of the prisoner of war holding places.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes?
The British dead, were they sent back to England?
No. Britain has a long tradition of burying soldiers more or less at the site where they fell. There were not, if you look at British military tradition going way back, they typically bury their dead where they fell. It wouldn't surprise me if somewhere around here there are British soldier burial sites, but they typically did not mark graves in any way. There are a few cases where we know exactly where individual British soldiers were buried, but it's very, very, very rare. And usually it was more or less on the battlefields. And again, I'm pretty sure this gets to fairly recently that British have done that.
There is a marker down the Stony Point battlefield.
Yes.
The brass marker that shows where, I forget the exact number, but it was like 6, 7, or 8 soldiers were in fact disinterred. British soldiers were disinterred and sent back to England.
Oh, okay, so, but disinterred much more
Much
recently.
later.
Yeah, at the time they died, they were buried.
They were buried right there.
Yeah, I know
They were
from,
eventually repatriated back to England.
yeah, there's a few marked grave sites from soldiers who were killed on April 19th. There's one in the New Bedford, Massachusetts area of a soldier who was killed in September 1778. There's a few here and there, but for the most part, we don't know specifically where the men were buried. They weren't buried with any ceremony or any markers, which is kind of sad, but. Other questions?
Just
Alright.
to add on,
Oh,
yeah, one guy who we do know where he's buried is, of course, Mungo Campbell, who was an officer. I know we're not covering officers right now, but he was the commander of the attack force against Fort Montgomery. He was killed leading one of the charges, and he was brought down to Lower Manhattan the day after the battle and buried in St. Paul's Churchyard down by the World Trade Center site. So he's on the ground there somewhere, unmarked grave. They do have the record showing he was brought there and buried, but where on the ground is exactly, we don't know. And it's ironic because, of course, who else is buried in St. Paul's Churchyard? And the church actually is Richard Montgomery, the guy who Fort Montgomery's named after. So it's kind of an ironic little twist to the Fort Montgomery story.
Yeah, it is a good point that an officer was more likely to be brought back to a nearby garrison town or somewhere where there was a proper cemetery and whatnot, and buried with some ceremony. Even for officers, exceedingly rare to send their remains back to Britain. It just wasn't a thing unless you were Admiral Nelson. But yeah, just generally uncommon, except for the most highest ranking people to have their remains sent back home. All right, another question. All right.
Was
Hi,
it
if I
common
can
that
get
when an area was captured, that the internment process would include the camp followers?
the internment process?
Meaning they took all these folks from Canada to Lancaster.
Yes.
You're assuming that they took the 10% wives and children with them?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I would think you said burial, not the capture. Yeah, yes. When a garrison fell and there were wives of soldiers who were there in the garrison, they became prisoners of war just like the soldiers did. And I got lots and lots of information. If anybody wanted to invite me to a talk somewhere to talk about British soldiers' wives, I would be happy to do it because I got the info on that topic.
Be here next April.
All right.
What was the pay like for the military soldiers?
That's an interesting question. What was the pay like for British soldiers? Well, there's a lot of information about that in a book that I know of. But in general, it was a low wage. It was the kind of wage that a common laborer might make for a day's work. But the soldier didn't have to pay for his own lodging. The soldier did have to pay for his own clothing and his own food. Well, guess what if you enlist in the U.S. Army today that you have to pay for? Your clothing and your food, yeah. So it's not any surprise. It's very normal for soldiers to have to pay for their own thing. But if you are not a soldier and you're earning money, what do you have to pay for? Your food and your clothing
and your lodging.
and your lodging, right. So at least the soldier, so people are like, oh my God, the soldiers, they have to pay for their food, they have to pay for their clothes. Well, don't all of us? It's not that big a surprise. You got the money. It's just that the Army manages all that more than for a civilian. But the soldiers do at least get free lodging. And soldiers have a lot of opportunities to make additional money besides their base pay, which is, again, a thing a lot of books overlook. Anytime soldiers have to go out and build fortifications, they get paid extra. Anytime they have to make roads, they get paid extra. Anytime they have to row boats, they might get paid extra. I talked about these men who work as tailors and shoemakers and other things. They're getting paid extra for doing that work for the Army. So the base pay is low, but there's a lot of other opportunities to earn money on top of the base pay. It's a great question.
If your husband fell in battle, were you taken care of? Were the widows and children taken care of by the Army?
They absolutely were, yes. Were the widows and children taken care of by the Army? Yes, absolutely. The women were given the option of being sent back to Great Britain, a free ride back where you came from, or actually back to your husband's hometown. So we have examples of soldiers who married in America and then their wives, after their men died, went back to England to their man's hometown, because you could legally do that if you wanted to. Again, it's up to the woman. And then when they get back to England, they get some money to get to the place. So yeah, the women are actually well taken care of. Some women did remarry into the Army. There's a big myth that women had to remarry within 24 hours or 48 hours or 70, depending who's telling you the myth. The time changes. And it absolutely wasn't true. We have examples of men who died and then their wives remarried in America to other soldiers 3-4 years later. Now, what were they doing in the time in between? Well, I don't know. But they clearly didn't have to remarry immediately, or they, I don't know, disappear or something. So, and there's a lot more detail we could go into on that, it's a great subject stuff, but yes, widows were looked after is the bottom line. Yes?
So since uniforms are unit specific, when you were drafted into another one, like some of these guys hopped around quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
Were their uniforms, their jackets, or whatever, made up to be the new unit? Were they given new uniforms? How did that work?
Okay, it's a great question. Now, I already mentioned that the question was about all these soldiers who switch regiments. And every regiment had some distinctive attributes to its uniform. So what happens if guys switch regiments? I mentioned that the soldier owns his own clothing. So how does this all work? Put it in a nutshell, a soldier gets a new suit of regimental clothing once a year. Now he can keep the old stuff if he wants it, because he owns it, he paid for it. But the new stuff is going to come from the regiment he's in at the time the new clothing is received by that regiment. If he gets drafted from one regiment to another one, he keeps the same uniform he already has until that new regiment gets new clothing. And then if there's any reason to say, hey, today we're going to go out in our old clothing, guys, because we don't want to wreck the new clothing doing what we're doing, then yeah, he goes out in clothing from a different regiment than the one that he's actually in right now. And we have a lot of details about this and how it worked. But yeah, you keep your old clothing for as long as it lasts, so you might have 2 or 3 or 4 coats, and they could be from 2 or 3 or 4 different regiments. And every time you get drafted from one regiment to another regiment, you get a fresh new enlistment bonus, which is kind of cool, because that's about 2 months' pay. So, why, oh boy, there's people going from one regiment to another. Hey, that's a pretty attractive thing to do if you're a soldier. Any other questions?
This might be a little off topic, but if you look around at the landscape here, you figure your markers are up here, the river below you. How did they take this place? Like, numbers game, just too many of them?
I'm going to let Grant answer that question specifically, but they used some trickery.
Okay.
Yes, they didn't land directly at the fort itself. They landed down in Stony Point, marched up and over Buckberg Mountain, Dunderberg Mountain, and just as an aside, people ask that question, how'd they know the fort was here? How'd they know the river? Well, as you mentioned earlier, the 26th had come up here in 1770, so there weren't, the British really knew their way around the Hudson Valley, certainly. So they, instead of hitting the fort from the river where the cannons were, and they instead hit the fort from the back, so to speak. And it was a numbers game. The Americans really needed about 5,000 troops to properly man the fort walls. They had maybe 500 here, max. So they wound up just manning the 3 readouts. Apparently that's what pretty much most of the accounts seem to agree on, and made 3 strong points that the British then attacked. So, but yeah, it really came down to a numbers game.
Yeah, if you want to attack a fort that's designed to defend against the sea, then you attack from the land side. All right,
Can you speak to how being parole worked? We always hear guys would be captured and then they'd be paroled. But effectively, I've never seen any explanation how that really worked.
all right, if you really wanna get a lot about it, send me an email and I'll tell you which books to get, because there's some good ones on it, but parole means that you still have the status of a prisoner of war, but you are not confined anymore. And your parole might give you a radius that you're allowed to be in, or it might be more general and say you can just go anywhere you want, but you're still a prisoner of war, so you're not allowed to do any
You're
fighting.
on your
or anything.
honor not to fight.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, you're on your honor.
But, you know, if they release hundreds of guys and they say, do you promise not to take up arms against us again? Oh, yeah, we promise. But really, that was, then they didn't?
I mean, this is a topic we could go on and on and on about, but there were times when it became problematic. Early in the war, and when you're talking about these nice, good, clearly defined, the British against the Americans, then officers get paroled on their parole of honor. Usually the common soldiers do not get paroled. They get held until they're exchanged, which is an entirely different thing. Then you go, we're gonna give you our prisoners, you give us your prisoners, and then they're not prisoners anymore. But a parole says you're on your honor not to participate in the war in any way. And sometimes it's a general parole, okay, officer, you're captured, but you can go back to England. Other times it's like, okay, you're captured, we're gonna hold you in Philadelphia. You're allowed to go out and wander around Philadelphia all you want, but you have to stay in Philadelphia. Now, if you violate your parole and you get caught again, then your experience as a prisoner is going to get a great deal worse than it was. So you have some incentive to honor your parole, and not just a sense of, oh, I must do it on my honor. It's not like, if I get caught, I am screwed, is why you honor your parole, right? It's gonna be bad if you don't honor your parole. Things got really bad in the southern colonies late in the war, when the British captured a large American garrison in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, which at that time was called Charlestown, South Carolina. Now the British had a huge number of prisoners of war, and you're trying to put down a rebellion. Remember, this wasn't one independent country fighting another independent country. As far as England was concerned, this was a British colony, and they were trying to quash an insurrection. Well, imagine if the British had won. What is the status of prisoners of war that you hold? You kind of, well, okay, so imagine you have like 20,000 of them. You're just going to execute them all as traitors? Usually that's not how you do it, right? You eventually say, okay, you guys lost. We're going to give you a parole. We're going to say, okay, we're going to release you. Don't fight anymore. Because that's when you're trying to subdue a part of your own population, that's kind of what your option is, right? You know, you can't send the guys home because they're already home. What do you do with these prisoners of war when it's a rebellion? So in South Carolina, they said, all right, sign a lot of paroles of honor. Guys, go back home, stop fighting. We won in South Carolina. And then all these American prisoners of war went back home, and then they turned around and started fighting again. So it didn't work very well, and violated parole. And they say, but think, what other options are there? You know, well, I think that in hindsight, the British might have said, well, instead we'll put them all in ships and send them to a penal colony somewhere. I mean, that's an option too. How would you look back at British government policy today if they had done that? What a bunch of jerks, they sent all these guys to a penal. You know, it's really, really hard to have a good policy for putting down a rebellion unless you just say we're just going to wholesale start executing people, which is also a really bad policy, right? So it's just something worth thinking about when you say, what do you do with prisoners of war who are rebellious citizens against your own government? It's not an easy problem to solve, and I think to this day it remains not an easy problem to solve, because no matter what solution you have, it has a lot of really bad side effects, right? So you can read more about policies on prisoners of war and parole in the American Revolution and other people's writings, because it's a big topic we could go on and on and on about. But that's in a nutshell. I hope that gave some answer to your question.